You are listening to the
World Extreme Medicine.
The World Extreme Medicine
Podcast.
Today, we're joined by Dr. Rachel Smith, a 28-year-old medical doctor from Belfast, who aims to make history as the first woman with type 1 diabetes to summit Mount Vinson, Antarctica's highest peak at 4,892 meters. So diagnosed with type 1 diabetes just before her third birthday, Rachel has never let her condition limit her ambitions. She was the first child in Northern Ireland to use an insulin pump and has since embraced technology advancement in diabetes management to fuel her ambitions and to fuel her spirit of adventure. So already having conquered the highest peaks in South America, Africa, and Australia, Rachel is now preparing for the ultimate challenge during 2 weeks in Antarctica's extreme conditions with temperatures plummeting to -30. So beyond personal achievement, Rachel's expedition supports breakthroughs in type 1 diabetes research efforts and aims to inspire others living with chronic conditions to adventure in various aspects of the world. So as both a medical professional and indeed an adventure athlete, she offers a unique perspective on pushing boundaries whilst managing serious health considerations. So join us in this conversation as we really just do a deep dive into Rachel's remarkable journey from a young patient to pioneering mountaineer to medical doctor. Welcome to the podcast, Rachel.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on today.
It's fantastic to have you with us, actually. I just wondered, could you speak to initially, if possible, just really what inspired you to take on the challenge of becoming the first woman with type 1 diabetes to summit Mount Vinson in Antarctica?
Yeah, so the idea to summit Mount Vinson, I suppose, started about a year and a half ago. I did Aconcagua, which is the highest mountain in South America, last January. And I suppose for probably the first time, I spoke about it quite publicly, and a lot of the questions that I got asked about Aconcagua, were surrounded like type 1 diabetes and how I managed it over such a long period of time and at altitude. So that kind of got me thinking a little bit, because I love mountaineering and I'm always like pushing myself in the mountains. And I thought, could I do something kind of bigger with that, not only just to reach a personal goal, but also to, raise some awareness and kind of do some good for type 1 diabetes and raise some awareness. And I think most people have heard of type 1 diabetes, but not that many people probably know what it's actually like to live with it, unless you live with it yourself or you've got a close family or friend with it. And so I'm quite passionate about kind of speaking a little bit more openly about it and the challenges, and therefore being a representation for, people who choose to push themselves and kind of be a bit of a positive force in that area.
So just looking at the diagnosis, could I get you to speak to, like you said, from such a young age, really being diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, how did it shape your approach to medicine and extreme challenges?
Yeah, so type 1 diabetes is definitely a huge part of, obviously, of who I am. And it definitely is a very difficult condition, and it has been growing up. It's definitely come with its challenges. But I suppose with those challenges, like that does help to shape who you are and how you approach not only day-to-day things and day-to-day challenges, but I suppose like the bigger challenges, like being a doctor and taking on some of these bigger mountains. I suppose with type 1 diabetes, every decision that I make generates a huge amount more. Like even I suppose the simple decision to say even come on this podcast tonight, thinking how much insulin do I have on board? When was the last time I ate? Have I exercised today? How will that influence my readings over this, hour and a half? So when, that's transpired to even bigger challenges, it definitely does kind of shape how you think. It forces you or makes me kind of problem solve ahead of time. So if I'm, both in the hospital, working as a doctor, and then also on the mountains, I'm thinking ahead to what all the various outcomes could be, and how I can cope and adapt with those, almost ahead of time. So that definitely has probably been one of the biggest things that I've noticed in how it's shaped my perspective and shaped my mindset. yeah, but so there's a lot I could speak about, but that's probably one of the bigger things that comes to mind.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And to your point, actually, Rachel, about the admin involved, but also the consideration, like you said, for future exercise. What you have already done, and there's lots of, I guess, in a way, multifactorial things which you play into that you're managing your diagnosis and managing the diabetes. Could I get you to speak to really your experience really quite early on about being the first child in Northern Ireland to use an insulin pump and how diabetes management technology has evolved indeed during your lifetime?
Yeah. So I was diagnosed just before my third birthday, so have some very early memories of this, but I suppose off the back of this challenge and talking about all of this a lot more, I've kind of delved into it and had a lot more conversations with my parents, who were the main people who had to kind of deal with that back then. When I was diagnosed for the first year of my diagnosis, so between 3 and 4, I was on a regime called fixed daily injections, which is where I had fixed amount of insulin at certain times of the day for a very set amount of carbohydrates. And the practice wasn't really to eat or to do any insulin outside of that very kind of strict regimen. So for a 3 or 4 year old, it's obviously very difficult to manage that, and it's quite restrictive, and would generate for my parents quite a lot of concern about how that kind of lifestyle would influence someone growing up, which was definitely a huge thing. So they really pushed for the insulin pump. They'd heard about it and they'd done some of their own research. And I'd taken a case to actually my local hospital, the Ulster Hospital in Belfast, Southeastern Trust, to kind of show them the research and ask, was there any way that I could be put on the insulin pump, to which they approved. And from that point onwards, it definitely made a huge difference, because it just gives so much more flexibility. You can administer much smaller amounts of insulin. You can administer that insulin much more readily at different points of the day. And you can adjust things like basal or background insulin to help kind of mitigate those extreme highs and lows. And so for me, like, my memory of my childhood and growing up with type 1 diabetes obviously has had its challenges, but I don't feel like I had a different experience to my peers, which is probably one of the more positive things to have come from the advancements in technology, especially for children. And then that kind of progressed over the years. Like the CGM, the continuous glucose monitor, came out in, I think, 2015, 2016. Initially it wasn't on the NHS, so actually it's like we self-funded it like kind of intermittently for maybe like a year and a half. And then it eventually came on the NHS, which was a huge difference. And I think most type 1 diabetics now use that now to measure their glucose. And at the minute I'm actually using the control IQ, which is the pump and the sensor. They talk to each other, to kind of help mitigate those, again, background extreme highs and lows. So the technology has come on incredibly over the last like 25 years, and ultimately has facilitated me being able to take on like a challenge like this. So definitely a huge thing.
So let's pivot slightly, Rachel, and look at some of the unique physiological challenges, really, that type 1 diabetes presents at extreme altitude in the severe cold of Antarctica, ranging up to indeed -30. Could I get you to speak to some of the considerations, really, that are top of mind for you whilst managing type 1 diabetes in an environment like that?
Yeah, for sure. And there definitely are quite a few things that make the type 1 diabetes presents, and challenges it presents at altitude and in cold conditions. It can sometimes be hard to isolate the exact cause and effect relationship, just because there's so many different things that can affect your body at altitude. But there are definitely a few general patterns that I've noticed. Like at lower altitudes, when you're exercising kind of long hours, back-to-back days, I find that my body becomes more sensitive to insulin. So I either need to tail back my background insulin or eat more carbohydrate to kind of avoid lows at the lower altitudes. On the flip side, kind of as I get higher, particularly when going for a summit night, like 4, 5, 6,000 meters, I find that the lower oxygen level causes that like stress response in the body, so more adrenaline, more cortisol, and actually tends to drive my glucose readings up at the higher altitude. So I do actually notice quite a big difference as I ascend the mountain, which is quite interesting. Altitude also suppresses your hunger, especially as you get, again, that bit higher. The lower oxygen levels means that the oxygen is, goes to the brain, goes to the lungs, less so to the gut and the abdomen, which means that you just really just lose your appetite and can become quite nauseous. So then having to balance that on top of getting enough carbohydrate in to, mitigate hypoglycemia or low blood sugars, and also fuel the expedition is also quite a big thing. And with the extreme cold, being careful to avoid my insulin freezing is also probably one of the biggest things I need to think about kind of ahead of time. If insulin freezes, it essentially becomes ineffective. So yeah, having lots of backups and having kind of a pretty secure plan in place to avoid that from happening is probably one of the big things that I need to think about. But yeah, that's kind of where experience and that from previous expeditions and background knowledge definitely comes into place. But yeah, there's some of the few of many things that I've noticed that have definitely affect type 1 diabetes at altitude.
Yeah, indeed. And actually that tees me up quite nicely actually for the next question, which is kind of in a way rolling two questions into one, which is just how you prepare differently for high altitude expeditions, and lends itself to, like you said, analog environments from previous summits, Aconcagua, Kilimanjaro, and others. Could I get you to speak to maybe the learning you're going to carry forward for Mount Vinson from some of these other climbs around, like you said, the control of temperature and indeed the energy levels and calorie burn and calorie consumption that you're going to need for a climb like this?
Yeah, for sure. And I have learned a huge amount from previous climbs that will definitely benefit me and be invaluable on Vinson. And probably one of the biggest things is knowing how my body in general reacts to altitude, and then also having that background knowledge of knowing how in general my type 1 diabetes reacts to various extreme environments and altitude. Things like even learning to trust my body as well is like quite a big thing. When you're at a high altitude, minus 30 degrees, taking your gloves off to check your blood sugar can also actually be actually really quite unsafe. So being able to feel kind of roughly what my blood glucose is, and then act on that. If I need to take 5 minutes to eat something, I can do that. I think one of the main things, or one of the huge things that I don't think is talked about a lot, because a lot of it, I think, the questions and when I talk about it, a lot of it, it's physical. I think the mental side of things actually is something that isn't spoken about as much, because like there is, even what I was saying about before, with even just a small decision like, okay, coming on the podcast, there's a huge mental load that kind of even comes with that, like day to day, like thinking about what my readings are going to do, kind of problem solving ahead of time. So when you transfer that to the mountains and having the mental load of having to think about what my glucose is and trying to mitigate hypoglycemia and hyperglycemia, but also focus on the task of getting to the top of these mountains, it can definitely be a huge thing. So learning how to cope and manage that mental side of things from previous expeditions, and during my training this year will be a huge benefit. And also like the post expedition period is also quite a big thing. So a lot of the focus again is quite often on the lead up to the climb and the climb itself. But there's a huge post expedition period where I tend to go quite low for sometimes up to 6 to 8 weeks. Getting back into training is quite difficult. Eating, not needing the same insulin for the same amount of food. So yeah, there's a huge pre, during, and post side of things that from previous experience definitely will benefit me this time.
Could you to speak to really, it's interesting, and I really interested to see your answer to this, really around the interplay of being a medical doctor, but also, balancing the medical knowledge of risk with the desire for adventure and to push boundaries. And there's famously sometimes a lot of cognitive dissonance around the fact you're aware, people can be aware of the risks, but really let the adventurous ambition almost get the better of them sometimes. Could I get you to speak to that interplay and how you have to maybe, or I guess in a way, be conservative about your expectations, but also still have that risk benefit analysis in your mind when
Yeah.
you're on expedition?
Yeah, of course. And this is a good question. And definitely something that I've thought about a lot in the background, and definitely been a huge part of my decision to even take on this challenge and do Mount Vinson. I think as medics, especially, we often know a little bit too much at times, but I think overall I do tend, or I do try to at least use it to my advantage as best as I can. I find that understanding the physiology of how type 1 diabetes actually works and operates, although it's not always as black and white as that. But that coupled with understanding the physiology of how the body adapts to altitude and extreme environments, having kind of those backgrounds, I definitely find beneficial and helps me both ahead of and on these expeditions. I think it's like that coupled with my experience and kind of to the best of my ability, knowing how I can cope in these situations, helps me to balance that risk, and kind of, balance the risk and as well as the challenge of taking on something like this. I'd like to think that if I was in a situation that, I started to feel a little bit dangerous, or I wasn't 100% happy, that I'd be able to take a step back. But, anecdotally, that is not always the case on these big mountains. And you do hear of people just pushing on beyond that. So yeah, it's a very interesting question, and definitely something that I think about and continue to think about for something like this.
Yeah, indeed. And to your point, actually, Rachel, about, being in analog environments and understanding how you react and how you manage the diabetes in these environments is hugely powerful, because you can call forth a lot of that learning from other environments. And so, it really, I think that's quite a precious tool to really navigate future expectations. Could I get you to speak to just, I guess, in a way, some of the gaps that you've articulated, Rachel, that exist in type 1 diabetes at altitude? Just could I get you to speak to, maybe just as a practitioner and indeed as a medical professional, and an appreciation of the literature, is there any significant gaps which exist within sort of managing diabetes at altitude?
Yeah, and to be honest, there's I think it's quite a big gap. There actually really isn't that much research about type 1 diabetes at altitude, and especially type 1 diabetes at altitude over, an extended period of time, like, 2+ weeks. There are a small number of studies, but they're quite often just like at one point in time. And also, because there hasn't been a huge amount of them, that I've found that they've had some conflicting evidence. Like, some show you tend to go hypoglycemic at altitude, whereas others suggest that you go hyperglycemic. And I haven't found there to be like a strong consistency with how like the research and how the body actually does adapt to altitude, which I appreciate is difficult, because if it's climbing at high altitude is not your everyday sport, and even less so for people with type 1. So it definitely is like something that it is difficult to research. And I find that my knowledge has come from either my own experience or having spoken to other type 1 diabetics who have done some of this kind of stuff, which I have done, and I find it to be quite interesting. As part of this expedition, I am definitely keen to contribute to that field. I'm going to keep all of my data. I'm very open to sharing that on the flip side, to kind of push a bit of research in this field, because I definitely find it very interesting, and I do think it could help others who are looking to take on something like this.
So could you just walk us through, and indeed for listeners or viewers, just your training regime, really, Rachel, that maybe incorporates CrossFit and indeed endurance running and maybe some mountain training, just to really, I guess, in a way, prepare you for the demands of Antarctic mountaineering?
Yeah, of course, of course. And training is obviously a huge part of the lead up. At the minute I'm training, 5 to 6 days a week around shifts in the hospital, just kind of depending on what my roster is looking like. And this is pretty much split between gym training and endurance running training. The gym side of things involves building up strength, conditioning, and some more specific strength training, such as sled pulls, which will be important on Vinson as we do pull heavy sleds from base camp up to low camp on the mountain. And then from the running side of things, I'm just gradually just building that up and getting the distance in and building up aerobic capacity. It's hard to mimic the Antarctic environment in Australia or even in the UK. But I'm going to be getting out to the mountains over the next few months as it gets a bit colder out here in Australia. Carry a heavy pack for a number of hours and hopefully get to some snowy and icy or parts to refresh those skills. And yeah, just keep building on that and just consistently working as I get a bit closer to December.
So could you just speak to really your work with Breakthrough TD1 or type 1 diabetes to leverage your expedition for fundraising and awareness? Why did you choose the organization, and indeed, what are some of the endpoints you're looking to achieve?
Yeah. So I'm working closely with Breakthrough T1D, both the UK and Australia branch. Breakthrough T1D are one of like the leading type 1 diabetes research and advocacy organization. They are involved with and fund so much of the type 1 diabetes research. And when I reached out to them that I wanted to work with them for this expedition and raise some money for them as part of it back in December, January time, it was met with such a positive response. And they've been so great with helping me to kind of share my story, and getting very involved with me both here in Australia and back in the UK. They ultimately want to work towards finding a cure for type 1 diabetes, and the mindset they foster a really positive outlook on living with type 1 diabetes. Both of these are like a vision that I share. So working with them throughout the year is definitely something that excites me a lot and is why I've chosen them. And also I'll also be speaking at their Type 1 Summit conference in Brisbane this July. So yeah, plenty of opportunities from that side of things. And yeah, so they've been really, really great. So excited to be working with them this year.
No, that's fantastic, fantastic, and like you said, there'll be, I guess, in a way, symbiotic relationship as far as they'll be interested in some of the data that you're collecting and indeed the
Yeah.
experiences you're getting from the expedition. Can I get to speak to that kind of tees me up quite nicely as we come into land? A couple more questions. One would be really around technological devices, Rachel, that you're, and indeed backup systems, because you do need a semblance of resilience in technological devices if one fails, that you're going to rely on to manage your diabetes during the 2 weeks in sub 30-degree temperatures. Could you get to speak to the sort of, in a way, your mindset and indeed your system of utilizing different technologies just to provide some resilience?
Yeah, absolutely. This is an interesting question because I did actually have a pump failure on Aconcagua last year, about probably less than a week into the climb, and my pump just stopped working and I couldn't get it to fix itself. So I thankfully had a backup pump, but I have lots of backup and insulin pens as well. But having been through that experience, which definitely was quite scary at the time, it has reinforced the importance of having the backup technology and not relying on technology, number one, like 100%, because it as incredible as it is, it definitely does have, it definitely does have its limitations. For the climb, I'm planning to use my current insulin pump and continuous glucose monitor, and use the closed loop technology as much as I can. I'll bring backups of an insulin pump and plenty of sensors. And I'm also very comfortable using the insulin pens and the manual glucose monitors as well, as like a third and fourth backup if I need to. In terms of technology, for me, I found that it has been reliable both in these cold conditions and at altitude previously. And I hope I have the same experience this time. Things that I use to help mitigate any risk of anything happening to it is, having last time I used hand warmers like against my skin, close to the sensors and pockets as well, just to help avoid it from getting too cold and protect it from like the harsh kind of temperatures and wind, which I again find useful. So yeah, as incredible as it is, it definitely does have its limitations. So I will be prepared for all eventualities.
And just finally, Rachel, actually, if we could just get you to speak to, I guess in a way, the message you hope to send to other young people, really, that are living with type 1 diabetes, just from a perspective of, the ability to go on expedition and to, achieve your dreams. Could I get you to speak to sort of that message that you're hoping to send to others?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is definitely a big reason why I've chosen to do this expedition like the way I have. I think growing up with a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes, it's not infrequent to have, people tell you that you can't or you shouldn't do something. And so I think one of the main messages that I want to get through with this is that I want to, challenge these perceptions, and I want to challenge the, perceived limitations of what people living with type 1 can achieve. Because although it is an incredibly difficult condition to manage, and I never want to, to downplay that, there is a huge, I believe anyway, there's been a huge amount of positive things that I've gained as a result of having it, resilience, determination, adaptability. So I like to think that I'm actually taking on this challenge as a result of having type 1. And that's the kind of mindset that I want to foster into and to kind of show, especially to other young people with type 1 diabetes who maybe grow up a bit worried or scared or thinking that they can't do something that they absolutely can.
No, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. And like you said, it serves as a massive enabler and an aspirational boost for others in that space. So absolutely. Listen, Rachel, it's fantastic to speak to you and really just get your thoughts across this fantastic challenge. We'll signpost in the show notes some of the resources that you mentioned, certainly with Breakthrough TD1. And it's just fantastic just to get your perspectives and insights. Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Really appreciate you having me on today.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on whichever platform you're listening to. Please also head over to the World Extreme Medicine website, where you can find more engaging content on extreme medicine webinars and indeed the collection of courses from our global network, including humanitarian, disaster relief, expedition, space, military, tactical, and performance medicine. Thanks again.